¿qué les diría a ustedes? Les diría que se las jueguen por las cosas que creen.
Así que yo los quiero motivar. El camino del servicio público tiene distintas caras, distintos caminos, pero hay uno que es fundamental y me alegro mucho que estén todos juntos en esta instancia, que es la formación.
No, hombre, a mí mis felicitaciones a ustedes y decirles lo que ya les dije, son líderes, así que sigan cultivando, sigan formándose, sigan generando ese valor mayor que los convierte en líderes.
Y construyan sobre cimientos, porque la verdad es que necesitamos renovar la política, pero renovarla bien.
Porque yo sí creo que los jóvenes tenemos mucho que decir.
Sorry. What causes poverty? Nothing. It's the original state, the default and starting point. The real question is, what causes prosperity? This is a very well-known phrase from our guest, which best illustrates the dilemma that guides the study of economics, how we can achieve prosperity and best economize our means. Bachelor of Arts in Business Administration, Master of Science in Informatics from the Jönköping International Business School, Master of Arts in Political Science from the University of Lund, and Ph.D. on Agricultural Economics from the University of Missouri, Columbia. Author of The Problem of Production, New Theory of the Firm, and The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized, How Regulations Affect Our Everyday Lives. Academic researcher and education in entrepreneurship, fellow of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and what brings us here today, expert in the Austrian School of Economics. After this, we begin this conversation that aims at intellectual enrichment and training for young leaders. Welcome, Per. The option to share your presentations is now available. We invite you all to leave your questions in the Q&A section so that Per can answer them at the end of the presentation.
All right, thank you so much. So I was not going to use a slideshow, so you have to look at my face. I'm sorry about that.
That's fine.
But so I was asked to talk a little bit about Austrian method and how the Austrian school is different from other schools of thought in economics. And as you might know, if you take economics courses in the beginning, you go through the logic and you go through the reasoning, you go through the intuition behind economic concepts. And the way I usually phrase this is that you learn sort of the gang sign of economists. So it's the supply and demand, like this, right? And you move the curves back and forth. And that's practically all you get in terms of the reasoning and the intuition and the logic. And as soon as you get to a little more advanced level, then what you start doing is math. So you start working with equations, you start using mathematical functions, you start taking first derivative and the second derivative, partial derivatives, and you use all this kind of mathematical magic to find maxima and minima, and you try to figure out how to maximize the system. So in a sense, this is made to supply the planner with a way of figuring out how to maximize society, especially the economy, which is sort of starting halfway and starting using a bunch of assumptions that are not absolutely correct and sometimes not even close to it. So the Austrian school uses a very different method and tries to create understanding of or for the economy and how the economy works. So it's closer in a sense to those first courses that you take where they show you the logic and they show how to think about the economy. But of course, Austrian economics goes much deeper than you go in the first few classes. And Austrian economists would argue that there is no reason to put this stuff in math. The the reason you would put it in math is to calculate exactly solutions to problems. But in order to do that, you need to know a whole lot about the problem. You need to be able to demarcate, that is to separate specific variables and how they relate to each other, so that you can then use math and estimate or precisely figure out the relationship between these variables. Now, this is a huge problem in the social world, and what economics tries to do is to understand the social world. The social world consists of people, and people are not simple variables. People are not rocks. We don't act exactly the same way over and over again. There's no way of predicting exactly how we will act in a certain situation. We don't even know on what grounds people take actions, right? So in a certain situation, someone might act in a certain way. In the same situation later on, that person might act in a very different way. Or in the same situation, two people with the same data, same impressions, the same context might act in very different ways. So you have to use a different method when studying people than when you're studying dead things and sort of mechanistic universe. So if you're studying planets and how they, say the planets in our solar system orbit the sun, then there's a regularity to it, where we assume that there are just a certain number of forces involved. That means that the exact route these planets take and how they are related to each other, these routes, they're perfectly predictable, and we can foresee exactly when the planet is going to be in line with another planet. And we can do this on a very, very specific level, very detailed level. We know exactly, because we have the math and we have figured out the functions and so forth. With people, it's very, very different. And economists have sort of always understood that the economy is different and that people are different. And you can start with talking about the free will and things like that, but it's not necessary to go there. Instead, all we need to do is really start with ourselves and look at people around us and realize that we have very different views of things. We have different goals, we have different aims, and we see things differently. We solve problems in different ways. And because of this, the phenomena that happen and sort of emerge on an aggregate level, so such things as society, or how people interact, or patterns in populations and so forth, they depend on how we act, right? So economists since old, say Cantillon back in the early 1700s, Adam Smith in the late 1700s, and then the economists during the 1800s, and also in the beginning of the 1900s, they were focusing on reasoning about people and people's interaction, assuming that people react to the world in a certain way. Now, Austrian economists do the same thing, and we sort of carry this tradition on, and are sort of true to classical economics and how economics was from the beginning, whereas modern is probably the wrong word, but mainstream economics, the way you learn it today in school, is very different. It's sort of turning its back on economics the way it was, and it wasn't supposed to be a physics or a chemistry. It always was supposed to be a sort of a social philosophy, if you will, or at least a social science, looking at people and what people create, and looking at people's actions and people's we call them institutions today, but things that we sort of agree are there and what they are like, but that we can't study. So Benjamin mentioned my book, which is on the theory of the firm. Now, a firm cannot be studied using means from the natural sciences. And why is that? Simply because you cannot measure a firm. A firm has no ending, a firm has no beginning, a firm has no clear boundaries. It doesn't have a weight, it doesn't have a color, it doesn't have a certain appearance. Because if you scratch on the surface, you realize that no, the firm is our understanding of this group of people working in collaboration towards some end, right? So when we visit an Apple store to buy an iPhone or whatever, we are really dealing with one person, maybe two, in that space, but we're saying that we bought it from Apple and Apple produced it and things like that. Well, Apple itself is nowhere to be seen. There's the logotype, there's the name, but Apple, the company, Apple, the actor, Apple doing something doesn't actually exist. It's our perception of what these people are doing together in creating these devices that we refer to as Apple. And we all understand what a company or a firm is, but you cannot measure it using traditional or standard natural science tools because it's not a thing, right? It's only in our minds. And a lot of things in the social world and in the economy are just like that. We are still acting based on our perception of these things, our understanding that these things exist and that other people are acting with respect to them. But we cannot measure them. We cannot put them in databases. We can take certain measures, such as how big is that firm in terms of the number of employees it employs. We can do that, but it still depends on the assumption that we already recognize what is an employee, what is that company, and how to calculate who is in and who is outside. Is why is, for instance, a subcontractor who works 100% for Apple not a part of Apple, but a part of some other firm? It's not obvious if you just look at it, if you just observe the data, quote unquote, then it's not clear at all. But if you look at it as a person in everyday life and how we act with respect to these things, it's obvious, right? So that is the problem, the sort of dilemma that that economics has to deal with and all social sciences have to deal with, that it's very, very difficult to study the social world because the social world consists of a lot of unobservables, as we call it, because we cannot directly observe these things because they exist in our minds. But we have a shared understanding of these things, so they're intersubjective. You might see them a little bit differently, but we understand them sufficiently similarly so that we act with respect to them in many different ways. So a good example is the state. Well, what is the state? Well, it is something that we think is there. We have a lot of people acting on behalf of the state, a lot of people claiming that we are all of the state. But what exactly is it? How do we measure it? Where does it hide? Where does it end? Where does it begin? All of those things are not easy to measure, but we can still understand it as human beings, and we certainly act with respect to it. So that is the huge problem with the social world, that all of these things are based on, in a sense, our personal perceptions and our personal valuations, and we act with respect to these things. So if you think of an alien coming to Earth and looking at a building, and people enter at 8 a.m. in the morning, and they exit at 5 p.m. in the afternoon. And other than that, you can't see anything. So you have lots of people just entering the building, and then after the workday, exiting the building. That's all you can see, but you cannot see that this building actually houses a number of businesses, and these people are employees, and they belong to, in a sense, different companies. All of these things that matter, the very reason that they enter the building, you cannot observe, but you can understand it. So the problem with economics and all social sciences is that we have to study this world where probably more things and more things affecting our behavior are unobservable than actually observable. So that's where you have to start and sort of put yourself in this position where you understand that there is so much going on that you cannot observe. So we need a theory first in order to figure out, what are we actually watching here? So the alien coming to Earth will just see the building and will just see all these people entering and exiting. There's nothing more to it. But when we watch this, we will immediately see that this is an office building. And we will see that these people are, or we will assume anyway, that these people are employees. These people are there to work and it's a normal work day because they show up Monday through Friday, but not Saturdays and Sundays. And we will also realize, judging from the different characters and the different images on the side of the building, that there are several different companies, and that these people are likely to work for different companies, and that the trucks coming and going are probably deliveries, and so forth. So we understand a whole lot more just because we are people, and because we have a preconception, an understanding for things like businesses, for trade, for the economy, for people, how they act, for employment, for all of these things. Okay, so considering this, then considering who we are, Austrian economics starts really with the assumption or the assertion that value is subjective. So economics tries to explain sort of what is going on in the world, where the world of people, how people react with respect to the outside world, with that means with respect to each other and also with respect to things. In order to understand this behavior, we need to figure out what makes people act at all. How come they act? What does action actually mean? Okay, so it doesn't really matter to economics exactly what people value, but the basic assumption instead is, no, we know that they value something. They value something, and that's why they act. That's where we start to figure out exactly what a person values and why they value it. Well, that's psychology, so we don't even enter there because that's a different science, right? It studies the inside of our heads, the inside of our minds, and those processes. But since economists are only studying and only want to understand sort of the interaction between people and the world, all we need to do is figure out why people act. And we already know this sort of intuitively, if you will, or through introspection or through experience. Pick your own argument. Different authors have used different arguments for this. But the starting point for Austrian method, what Mises referred to as praxeology, is the action axiom, or the understanding for action. What is human action? It's purposeful behavior. So we know that when someone is doing something, a person is doing something, they're trying to attain some kind of end. So because a person is acting, because they're doing something, we know already that they're trying to achieve something. We can't know necessarily what they're trying to achieve. We can guess perhaps, but it doesn't really matter. What we do know is that they're trying to achieve something. There's no such thing as acting without trying to achieve something. Now, from this then, we know that they're trying to achieve something that is meaningful to them. It might be the same as we are assuming that they are after it, but it might be different. But is this meaningful for them? It means that value is subjective. It's something that they require or that they want, and that they want necessarily more than what they have. So there's already a trade-off or a comparison between the situation this person is in and the situation they're aiming to achieve. Okay, you would not act if you thought that every option that you have, anything that you can possibly attain, is worse than what you already have. Then you would just do whatever it is you're doing. You would sit in your couch and eating potato chips and watching television, if that is what you're doing, instead of doing something else. But if you think that you can improve your situation on your own terms, whatever it is that you like or whatever it is you fancy, then you would act to do that if you think it's possible, right? So already through understanding the concept of action, we know that, first of all, the world is scarce, because otherwise we would pick everything at once. So we are choosing some other end, some other situation that we hope to attain over what we already have. So there's scarcity. We also know that, well, because we're acting to attain it and cannot get it instantaneously or immediately, we have already, or that actor has already identified two categories of things: means and ends, right? The end is what they're aiming for. That's what they're trying to attain. And to get there, you need certain means. At a minimum, you need some space for your body and some time, but you probably use tools, and you might use money. You might use some capital goods. You might use some some materials, what have you. But all of these things, you as an actor consider to be means toward that end. And that end, the value of it that you expect from it, is the reason why you try to attain it. And of course, that whole journey, if you will, from where I am to where I'm going is worth more than just staying where I am, or I wouldn't be doing it. It also means, of course, that there could be other potential outcomes, potential ends that you would like to achieve and that you might value more or less than what you already have, but they are not worth as much as what you're aiming for. Since it is on your own terms, since value is subjective, obviously you're going to choose whatever you think is the best for whatever reason, right? It could be as simple as thinking, well, I really like that end over there, but I think just because I like it so much, I'm not going to be able to attain it. And then you choose something else. But by doing that, you're revealing that your preference is this something else. So any action is always aiming for what you consider to be the best of the options available to you. Of course, this means we're studying people as they are, not people as functions, not people in models, not people with perfect information, because we already talked about several times how the action is on your terms, and it's based off of what you perceive. It's based off of what you value and all these means that you can identify and all these ways that you think is possible to get to that end and get to this better situation. In other words, human beings in Austrian economics are simply human beings. They have lots of flaws, lots of faults. They have imperfect information. They have all kinds of biases. They misunderstand all kinds of things. But what matters is that they act, and also then how they act, of course, because that's going to create the outcomes in the world. Because by using means, something that we identify, whether it's other people or it's things, we're causing change in the world. Because the whole point of an action is to create a situation where I'm better off on whatever terms, which means I'm using the means and I'm impacting, I'm creating change in the real world so that I get to the situation where I think I will be better off. Okay, so we have a great link between the subjectiveness or subjectivity of value, which is just in our minds, and the real world, because what we subjectively value will lead to our action, which is the bridge between our sort of internal life, what we personally value, and how that affects the rest of the world, right? So now we're in the real world, and where people are causing different changes, and they're affecting each other, they're interacting, and all of these things. So what can we say about this end that people are aiming for then? Well, the value for it to be attained is some sort of use of something. Now in economics, or in Austrian economics, that is consumption, right? So we're using it in order to get some form of satisfaction. That is the act of consuming it. It doesn't matter if the thing you're using will still be there after you've used it. Consumption is not the same thing as eating something. Consumption is just using for your direct benefit or for your direct pleasure. Now, since value was getting to this situation, and we said this satisfaction is value, what this means is that anything that is not consumption, anything that does not give you pleasure and satisfaction right away would be something else. And since we're acting in order to get there, then anything else would be a production undertaking, something that you consider a potential for leading to this end. Okay, so any action that you take that does not directly satisfy your wants is production. And this production is worth something only because it will lead to, or at least you hope it will lead to, some kind of satisfaction or pleasure in the end. So consumption is where value is. It's through the act or the process of consumption that we experience value, which is satisfaction. And everything else we do has a value because we expect it to lead to consumption. So you can see how in Austrian economics, value comes first, but it is last, because any production will lead to value at the very end. Hopefully, if we're right, we can make mistakes, right? There's plenty of uncertainty. We don't know if we will actually get to the point where we get to consume the outcome. We also don't know if the outcome is going to be just as valuable as we hoped for. So there's plenty of uncertainty. So there's sort of entrepreneurship involved in any action, and especially then, of course, when we're involving others and interacting with other people. So what this means, of course, is that all types of production is valued only by its expected contribution to consumption. And Karl Menger, the founder of Austrian economics back in 1871, talked about this in terms of a tobacco machine, where he said that this tobacco machine assumed that it can only be used to produce tobacco. And one morning, everybody just stops using tobacco. So no one is interested in tobacco anymore. And then he asks, what is the value of this tobacco machine? Well, the value of the tobacco machine, since it has no other uses, is zero. Okay, so the value of capital is completely dependent on the value contribution that it has towards an end that is valuable. Okay, and you can see now that Austrians are very different with respect to production than other schools of economics, because obviously it is the value of the expected consumption good that determines the value of capital, and capital is basically what we understand it to be. It's how we perceive it and how we choose to use it too. So capital, in terms of capital goods and materials and things like that, can be combined in different ways. So we say that capital is heterogeneous, which means capital is different things. It's not simply the dollar value of it, but it's different things. A pencil is not a freight train, and the freight train is not a factory. Now, this is obvious, but if you look at economic models from mainstream economics, then they use the dollar value, and then it's possible to just shift these values back and forth and change them a little bit to maximize the situation. For an Austrian, it's obvious that no, you can't make a factory out of a freight train. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort, right? And you would only do it if that time and effort is worth it with respect to the value contribution of that factory. Okay, so that's one thing. We've already mentioned two things where Austrian school is very different from other schools of economic thought, entrepreneurship and capital theory. And we've really just talked about action and why action is different. And of course, we start with action since it is so core to this. So let's get a little further and talk about how Austrian economics deals with these terms, because so far it's very philosophical, right? It's a bit abstract. It's not very clear. It's not abstract in the mathematical sense as in economics courses you take, but it's abstract in the sense that what does this have to do with the real world? What can we actually do with this stuff? Yeah, of course, the freight train is not a factory. Yeah, okay, of course, people act in order to achieve something of value. And okay, if they try to achieve something of value, all the other options are lost. So that's the opportunity cost of it. Yeah, okay, but what does this have to do with the real world? And it's a common but misplaced critique of Austrian economics that it is too abstract and philosophical. And that's probably because Austrian economists tend to talk too much about the philosophy instead of the application of it on economic phenomena. Okay, so let's talk about two different ways that that we use the method in Austrian economics, that is praxeology, or the sort of deductive logical method of economic reasoning that is traditional to economics. First, let's look at a concept, a core concept, diminishing marginal utility. Now, we know what that means. It means that the more you have of something, the less you value it. Okay. Sometimes this is interpreted as satiety. So One way this is taught in schools is simply that you let one of the students come up to the professor, and that professor will give you a scoop of ice cream and ask you, how, on a scale 1 to 10, how satisfied are you? And they will say, oh, pretty good ice cream, 8. And they will feed you another scoop and ask you again, and say, maybe 9. This is pretty good. And then they would feed you more and more and more. And after a while, you say, oh, no more, because I've had too much. Okay, this is not actually what diminishing marginal utility means. It is not about satiety. It's not about being full or having too much of something that you eat. It is how you value things. Okay, and to Austrian economics, it's not really about measuring things in the real world either. It's a concept that explains our actions and explains our behavior. Now, one example used by the old masters of Austrian economics is if you think of a farmer living alone, and he has several sacks of corn, and he can do different things with them. Well, this farmer has all kinds of options, of course, but subjectively speaking, what he personally values, number one is to eat a sack of corn so that he could survive. Had he had 2 sacks of corn, then he would eat the second 2 just to do more than just survive, but to be healthy and strong and things like that, okay? Had he had a third one, he would use it to feed poultry so he could have something else than corn to eat, right? Had he had a fourth one, then he would use the fourth one to produce coarse spirits. So basically a liquor, right? Because that's fun to have too. If you're alone in the forest and you have enough food, well, what are you gonna do? Of course, you want to drink some. And then if he has a fifth one, then he would feed a parrot because he's a little lonely, and he could talk to the parrot, maybe teach it how to talk and things like that. Okay, so that's his value scale. That's the order in which he values these different outcomes. It's how he ranks them. Okay, that's personal to him. Others might value it differently. For myself, I would of course put coarse spirits a whole lot higher than he does. But imagine then that he has 3 sacks of corn. Well, the first one he would use for just sustenance, to stay alive. The second one he would use for being healthy and full and strong. And the third one he would feed poultry. Okay, well, you get that. If you get a fourth one, he's going to use them for coarse spirits. Okay, if he loses one, well, then he's going to only eat the corn, right? But what happens then if, to him, these sacks of corn are equally serviceable? We say it doesn't really matter which one he uses to eat and which one he feeds to the poultry, right? So let's say that he marks them. So he marks them A, B, C, and then he loses one. So he has already decided, oh, I'm going to use the A sack for sustenance to just stay alive. I'm going to use the B sack in order to be strong and healthy, and I'm going to use the C sack to feed poultry. And then during the night, either there's a thief that steals a sack of corn, or there's a rat invasion and they eat 1 sack of corn. So the sack B disappears. It's gone in one morning. Now, what will happen? Well, obviously, he will still use A for sustenance and to survive. And C, he had already dedicated to feeding poultry. Losing B, it means that he's not going to be healthy and strong, so he's going to be really weak. This obviously doesn't make any sense, right? Because according to his own ends, his own ranking of the ends and the outcomes, he ranks being strong and healthy over feeding poultry. In other words, of course, he's just going to rearrange the sacks. He's going to use sack C for eating instead to stay healthy and strong. Because the sacks they're identical to him, and they can be used for either end. So he's going to use them in that order, right? So from his perspective, then, from his point of view, from his personal value ranking, there's no way he will give up the top choices on his value scale, on that list of values. But he's always going to aim for the highest value possible. And why is that? Well, because value is on his personal terms. It's his own satisfaction. It's what he's aiming for, right? So if he can use these sacks for exactly the same thing, it doesn't matter which one he uses, then he's going to use them in that order. Even if he loses one that he had thought would be used for some other end, he's just going to rearrange them. In other words, from an Austrian perspective, considering these sacks of corn and his value scale, there is no other way than having diminishing marginal utility. It has to be true. You can measure it if you like and ask people, how much do you value this and how much do you value this? But we already know that they will value the first one more than the second one, more than the third one, because they will use them in the order they value the outcomes. Okay, so it doesn't make any sense to excuse me. It doesn't make any sense to try to measure it. It also doesn't make any sense to try to draw a curve because these are personal values. And it doesn't make any sense to try to critique the concept or claim that it is wrong or figure out limitations to it, because this is just how we act as people. This is pretty obvious. So as a construct or as an understanding for the real world, diminishing marginal utility has no option. There's no limitation to it. It's not a weird concept. It's pretty obvious. It follows directly from how we act and how we see the world. Of course, we can change our views. We can change this farmer can say that, screw the poultry, I need liquor, so I'm gonna use something else. Well, then he has updated his value scale. And then of course he's going to choose to produce coarse spirits instead of feeding the poultry. But based off of his value scale, the way he values things, of course, he's going to value them in a diminishing order. So he's going to use the first one to the most highly valued end, the second one to the second most highly valued end, the third one to the third most highly valued end, and so forth. There's no other way. So these are the things that Mises would claim are apodictically true. There's no other way. It has to be true always for any person. And it follows directly from action. Okay, so this is just a concept, and this offers us some insight into the reason people act in certain ways. And of course, from diminishing marginal utility, we also get things like, downward sloping demand curves. It's exactly this, right? It's just that here we have the explanation for it, and we know that it has to be true. You cannot have a demand curve that slopes upwards, for instance, because that just means that something else has happened, because marginal utility must be diminishing. There's no other way. Just because you're choosing, and you're choosing on your own terms, it means it has to diminish. So if you see something in the real world where it seems to diminish and then it goes up again, then something else has happened, or one of the actors has considered something else, or they see other options suddenly, or something like that, right? So it's a reason to study why the real world seems to deviate from the theory, but it's not a way to falsify or try to critique the theory, because the theory, it simply has to be true, unless we did something wrong in the logic, okay? Now, this method can also be used to explain phenomena and institutions, as we call them, in the real economy. So Menger had a famous article on the origins of money, where he argues for what money really is, its function in the economy. And he starts with a barter economy. So where you produce something and you exchange it with someone else who produces something that you want. And the reason you exchange is that you want what they have more than what you're giving up, and they want what you have more than what they are giving up. So both get better off, right? So this is obvious, because why would you do it unless you think that you're going to be better off? Well, you wouldn't, on your personal terms, of course. So obviously every voluntary trade needs to be a mutual benefit, or at least expected mutual benefit. Now, the problem here, of course, is if I want something that John has, but John doesn't want what I have, then there can be no trade. So there's a huge limitation, and I probably have to produce a lot of different things to be able to trade with all kinds of people. So say I only have eggs. Well, I need to find someone who wants eggs and trade with them, because otherwise I'm stuck with my eggs. And also have the problem, of course, that if I want to produce a new house, well, how do I get a house from someone trading and just exchanging with eggs? It's pretty difficult, and I don't think anybody would want to accept eggs, say 100,000 eggs for a house, because the house you can sit on the house and it doesn't go bad, but the eggs, what are you going to do with 100,000 eggs? So that trade will never happen. Well, since barter exchange is so limited, Menger argued, if I want what John has, if say John is selling butter and I'm offering eggs, and he says, no, I don't want any eggs, but I have plenty of eggs, but I could do bread, and I know that Jane has bread, and Jane might be willing to exchange some bread for my eggs. Well, then I can go to Jane and get bread for my eggs, and then I don't want bread, but I know that John wants bread. So bread would be a more saleable good, a good that is wanted by more people, and I would be able to facilitate the exchange with John so that I can get the butter. Okay, now when people start realizing this, they'll probably ask each other, well, so what do you want? How can I trade with you since you don't want what I have? And then they figure out who can I trade with, who wants what I have, and get something that he wants more. And they will choose the more saleable of goods. So in time, they will choose the more and more saleable goods, and more people will accept these goods, not because of what they are themselves. So say bread is one of those things. So you have a lot of people who are gluten intolerant and who are on high fat, low carb diets and what have you, all of these things, but they will still try to get their hands on bread because they know that bread can be traded with practically anyone. Okay, so already it's becoming a medium of exchange that you don't want for the sake of itself. You don't want it for what type of good it is, because you're not going to consume it, but you want it because that allows you to trade with someone else to get something you truly want. So we've moved from direct exchange for something you want, where both parties have to want what the other party has more than what they're giving up, to indirect exchange, which can happen in many stages, of course, too. But the more common one good is to use for indirect exchange, the more it sort of gets a value as a medium of exchange itself. So eventually this society will have fewer and fewer goods that everybody will turn to and use in exchange. And eventually they might end up with one or two. Like in the old day when we had a gold standard, or we have had sort of what is called bimetallism, where we use gold and silver depending on what kind the transaction was. It was for big and expensive things, we use gold, and otherwise we use silver. And why gold and silver? Well, that just happened to be the most saleable goods, the goods that most people accepted in terms of trade, not because they use gold and silver themselves, but because they knew or expected others to accept gold and silver in exchange. So here you can see how Austrians do not theoretically say that, oh, gold must be the currency, but Austrians argue that, well, money has, it's a good itself, but true money has a value because it has emerged through our behavior. So nobody decided that, oh, tomorrow we're going to use this item in order to indirectly exchange with everyone, because no one would accept that. Why would everybody start trading for this thing that this dude just decided everybody should accept? That's not what happened. Instead, they chose individually to indirectly exchange in order to get what they wanted themselves. So they were still acting purposefully. They were still aiming to attain a certain end, that is whatever good they were acting for, but they were acting in two steps rather than one. So they were acting first to get the medium of exchange, and then in the second stage to get what they actually wanted with that, using that medium of exchange as payment. Okay, and that's why we have historically different societies using different things for money. And we have all kinds of examples. They used cattle, they have used rocks, they've used seashells, they've used slaves, they've used gold, and they've used silver, they've used ivory, they use all of these different things have been used as money. And that explains perfectly the institution of money, what money means to us. It's not just a number, right? It's not the number on a dollar bill or something like that. It means something because we know that it is a medium of exchange. It's something that we can use in order to get something that we truly want. It's just a means. It's not an end in itself. So we might be saving for something later on, or we might want the purchasing power and save a lot of money in order to feel safe and feel that the uncertainty of the future is no problem, and we can always buy our way out or what have you, maybe lead a nice life. But it means something, right? If the alien, to use that example again, comes to this earth and sees money and sees that everybody's doing a lot of stuff to get their hands on money, and they will look at money and they'll say, what the heck is this? This is just a piece of dead trees with some coloring on it. Why does everybody want this? You can't measure that, right? And if you take examples like the Weimar Republic, where suddenly, well, there was plenty of money and people used it as money, they wanted money, and suddenly they didn't want it anymore. They acted so as to get rid of money as soon as possible. Well, why? Because it had lost its function as a medium of exchange. People were not accepting it because they expected the purchasing power to plummet. So it's much, much more than having pieces of paper or having gold coins or having whatever else. It has a meaning for us when we act and when we interact with other people. And that meaning is necessary for us to recognize in order to understand what is going on in the economy, right? We cannot just observe and hope that we capture some of this. Instead, we can observe people trading for money if we already have an understanding for what money is. So Austrian economics uses this traditional view of, or traditional way of reasoning in economics, where theory must come first. Theory determines what we see and sort of demarcates different phenomena from each other and different concepts from each other. It's through the lens of economic theory that we can make sense of the world and we can uncover what is actually going on. But we can't use data, the observations, and then try to figure out what actually happened. Because we need the theory to identify what is actually relevant and what is actually important to figure out. Okay, so I think I'm ready to take your questions if you have them. So this was a very quick overview and just going through what Austrian economics tries to do and how it tries to do it. I hope it wasn't too philosophical or abstract.
No, it was quite a good presentation. Yeah, I would like to answer some questions from the public. The first one from Jose Todorovic. Greetings, Per. Here in Chile, we always talk about emulating Sweden and its welfare state and to throw away neoliberalism. Yet many people ignore Sweden has diminished its welfare state and has become more neoliberal because of the economics problem it went through in the late 80s or 90s. What do you think will happen in Chile if the state grows even more justified by this fake Swedish narrative?
Well, yeah, I get that a lot with people approaching me saying that, oh, I heard you from Sweden. That's my favorite country. And I think the myth is sort of based on two different points in time. So the myth is based on the promise of the very progressive, sort of very socialistic, if you will, state in the early 1970s. And then they mix this, which was, I mean, that was the reason for Sweden's demise. That was the reason that Sweden imploded completely in 1992. And then they take this picture and they mix it with the view of Sweden growing rich in the early 1900s, and also Sweden being in pretty good shape right now. But neither of those things has anything to do with the welfare state, of course. So the welfare state doesn't really create any value. Entrepreneurs do that through production and through innovation, right? So what does this mean for Chile? Well, I mean, what it does mean is that the bigger the welfare state, the greater the burden on society, the greater the burden on the economy, which means that the government will crowd out private businesses supplying these services. It will also change incentives. It will distort investments, because in some areas it's simply not profitable anymore to invest, not because consumers aren't willing to buy or that it wouldn't benefit consumers, but simply because there's a state service that is close enough that it crowds out the private interest, which means that you will get a completely different economy. So entrepreneurs in a free market economy, then entrepreneurs would compete to produce as much value as possible for consumers, and that's where you would get economic growth, because they would compete with each other to produce whatever they think might be valuable to consumers. And they're hardly ever right, but whenever they are right, and they're helping each other to figure that out as soon as possible. Now, when the state enters, what you get is a different set of investments. So you create a production structure. So the economy's whole production is different from what consumers would have helped entrepreneurs figure out would be the most valuable one, right? So in itself, since the whole economy is producing less value, is doing less valuable things than it would do had entrepreneurs been free to do whatever they like, right? So I can't say anything about when Chile will implode like Sweden did in '92. I don't know when the central bank will crush the economy and destroy the currency. I can't say anything like that, but what I can say is that since it is a burden on the economy and causes these distortions, it does make everybody in Chile less profitable, less prosperous.
Yeah, right. I also have a question here from Vicente Quilodran. I have a question. In the moment you started to talk about how you can't measure economics like a natural science, isn't there the possibility for economics being something like quantum mechanics, where the movement of particles is uncertain, but they can be understood with complex mathematical equations that represent that indetermination or uncertainty?
I'm not an expert on that, so I can't really tell. But here's the thing. I think for as long as we don't understand people completely, we can't really predict people completely. And we also know, and from my perspective in entrepreneurship, we also know that what we actually value in goods and what we prefer to buy as goods is not necessarily what they're presented to do, but and very often entrepreneurs fail not because their offering is not valuable or it doesn't work, but simply because they cannot communicate it to consumers. So the problem is that we're not really, as consumers, sort of dragging entrepreneurs to produce for us. Instead, we are more like arbiters. We are determining whether something was valuable after the fact, which makes this problem a whole lot worse, because it's not only that we act in terms of many unobservables and all these institutions and have wild ideas about things, but it's also that we're reacting to the world. And Mises actually talks about this in Human Action, and he says that what we're studying as economists is how people react with respect to the world outside us. And consumers are doing exactly that. I mean, they're on the market. When we're shopping, very often we might have a plan. We enter a grocery store and we want to buy chicken and rice, say, and then we enter the store and we see a big sign saying that, oh, look at that, this pears are really cheap, or these pears are really magnificent, or something like that. And you go, not a bad idea. I should probably grab some pears instead, right? So since this is the case, since our decision making does not happen until this last minute, it's really, really, really difficult to put it in a mathematical equation. It doesn't mean that it's forever impossible, but I don't think we're nowhere near predicting exactly. And if you can't predict exactly, then you have functions that say, oh, you might be able to say something about this stuff, but you can't tell beforehand how accurate it is going to be, right? And that's not very helpful. When you put it in math, you need the exact numbers. So, I mean, Austrian economists can sort of forecast in the sense that we can say that, well, if this happens, it's going to, if you go through with this policy, it will increase the cost of these goods. Well, that means that people will buy fewer of them, but they will probably pay a little bit of a higher price because there are fewer of them, because of diminishing marginal utility. But we can't say exactly how many fewer they will buy, because it depends on their options, what their choices are, and so forth. So we can say in what direction things will tend, but we can't really say exactly how much, because the world, exactly the way it is when they make these choices, they're what these people themselves perceive, is what the options they see and how they value them, and we're nowhere near to understand that.
Right. I also have 2 questions from myself. I would like to ask you about how you think regression theorem applies to Bitcoin. Since, I've seen Peter Schiff a lot on Twitter fighting it out with the Bitcoin people, and I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Basically, what you're asking is for me to pick a side.
Right? Absolutely, so yes.
I'm going to make a lot of enemies. Thank you very much. So, the way I see it is that the regression theorem, sort of what I saw, someone commented on this somewhere, can't recall where, saying that the regression theorem applies to the value of a money, the first money, but then it sort of takes a life of its own. And you can't say, I mean, the dollar doesn't go back to barter trade. And very often you have government stepping in and having legal tender laws and so forth, and just getting rid of the natural money, just like the gold standard was abolished, right? And then money or dollars, bills were used instead. So I'm not sure the regression theorem needs to be applied to new currencies, actually.
Yeah. And the other question, does mainstream Austrian theory say that we are looming a financial crisis generally in the world, thanks to the USA's high debt and low interest rates?
Did you say, are we in a crisis, or will we be in a crisis?
If a crisis is looming, will we have a crisis in the next few years thanks to the debt?
Well, I don't know about thanks to the debt, but well, there are several reasons why we might. The way the world looks today, with the Federal Reserve's printing of a lot of money and the borrowing and all of this stuff, it doesn't look good at all. And there needs to be some form of correction. Whether that will be sort of we're in a huge bubble, so either the bubble bursts and there's going to be bam and bang, and then we're in deep trouble for a little bit, and then we will carry on. Or if it will sort of deflate the bubble over a long time, who knows? I'm pretty sure that central banks and governments will do their worst in trying to print us out of the next bubble too, or when it bursts.
All right. Yeah. So Now closing, as young people, we would like to know your message to us. Many of us here have a deep interest and passion in freedom, prosperity, and peace. So we would love to hear your message. Likewise, we invite everyone to turn their cameras on so Per can see us.
Well, I think what really is my own passion is economic literacy. And I think the economic way of thinking is super powerful and super liberating for the mind. So figuring out how the world works is going to help us a lot, both in terms of our personal investments and in terms of our positioning ourselves and our families with respect to the future. So I think learning good economic reasoning is the first step, I think, and then trying to do as well as possible in the world the way it is.
I am moving the people, so please wait.
I think Felipe wanted to say something.
Yes,
right?
I want to ask a question. Do you think that the new constitution that is in process in Chile may move the country more to like Austrian economics, or will move us more to like Marxist? Because in Chile we're in the process of making a new constitution, and I want to know if you think that it will make the country like more like Austrian economic in the economic policy, or like more like to other or classical or Keynesian or Marxist.
I really have no idea because I don't know anything about the new constitution.
You don't know about the Chilean new constitution and the process that now we're having.
Right, I don't know anything about it. What I do know is that politicians really, really like Keynesian economics. Right, so I don't see why politicians would choose Austrian economics, because Austrian economics sort of ties their hands behind their backs. So, and even if you would get a constitution that is Austrian in some sense, I'm pretty sure over time that politicians would find ways to get around it and expand the state anyway. I mean, that's just from experience and from what I know from how politicians act.
This has been a great instance to learn and question our conventional wisdom-induced ideas on economics. Instances to sit down and to think and talk about these issues are the ones that must increase in a society looking for further development and welfare. Juntos por Chile would like to thank our great guests for accepting our invitation and taking the time to do such great talk, as well as all of those present for participating in this event. Thank you very much and good night.
So now I'll take the picture, so please smile, and I'm going to this. Thank you.
All right.
Great smiles.
Good night.